Caroline, and thanks, Kirsty, and hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to see if I could move these things forward. It should be magical, and oh, there we go. So welcome, everybody, and for those of you that came to the workshop in Windsor, I need to kind of give my apologies. I was caught in an airport in Denver, so I wasn't able to make the workshop, but I know that Donna Jean and Kirsty and the team, the Tamarack team, did an excellent job. So thanks for bearing with us. Sometimes travel does get us that way. So we're going to, in this webinar, we're going to spend a bit of time exploring collective impact. And actually, we're going to dive a little bit deeper on getting to a common agenda. Some of this will have been presented in the collective impact workshops that you guys all attended, whether it was in Hamilton or Red Deer, Medicine Hat, or Windsor, where some of it will be a little bit of a repeat, but with some new nuances, and then a lot of resources and tools that you can follow up on if you're interested in any of these ideas and pursuing them in any more detail. We want to start off by just giving you a little bit of a backgrounder on Tamarack, which we all know is an Institute for Community Engagement. Really at Tamarack, we have these 3 learning communities that we're supporting. The leading collaboratively one, also known as Tamarack CCI, is really focused on people who use collective impact approaches to address complex community issues. So it's for all of you who are practitioners in the field. What's really great about the Leading Collaborative website is that there are always new tools and new resources and blogs posted on that website. So we invite you to go to that site often. Our second learning community is focused on reducing poverty, and this is called the Vibrant Communities Learning Community. And some of you might be coming from that frame of reference. And again, there's lots of great tools and resources around comprehensive poverty strategies. And then our third community is really for those of you that are engaged at neighborhood change levels or really thinking about how we deepen the experience of community for citizens who are engaged in social change. So that's how we are organized at Tamarack. I lead the Vibrant Communities initiative, and Caroline and Kirsty, who you met earlier on the call, are quite involved with the collaborative leaders or the Leading Collaboratively Learning Center. This is my picture for those of you who haven't met me. I'm sure I've met many of you on the call. I'm the Vice President at Tamarack, and so as I said, I lead the Vibrant Communities Initiative, but I'm also responsible for some leadership to the Leading Community, Learning Community, and also for Tamarack overall. So we wanted to start off this webinar with a poll. And so this first poll is really to check where you are according to these 4 points. And Kirsty is making the poll open, and then we'll ask her to report on the results. So what is your knowledge and experience in collective impact? Did you attend the one-day workshop? Are you involved in an early stage collective impact initiative? Are you a member of a collective impact initiative, or are you a seasoned collective impact individual? So Kirsty, I can't see the poll pieces, so can you let me know when folks have been able to vote?
Sure. We've got 90% who have voted.
Okay, and what are our results?
Okay, so everyone's voted, and it looks like 60% attended the one-day workshop. 10% are in the early stages of collective impact, and our remaining 30 are members of a collective impact initiative.
Okay, great. So that tells me that we're early on for many of you. So some of you, those of you that are members of collective impact initiatives, may have already tackled the issue of a common agenda, or you might want to be going back and refining your common agenda. The whole notion of common agenda in collective impact, it's one of the first pieces of work that you want to be looking at. Once you've gotten through the 3 preconditions of influential champions, urgency around the issue, and adequate resources, then you start to focus on the 5 conditions of collective impact. And just as a reminder for everybody, these are the 5 conditions, and they're actually, collective impact is a really interesting framework for community change efforts. Some of us might say, oh yes, this is just like, how we've always collaborated. And to some degree, for some of your work, that would absolutely be true. But in other cases, you may be doing some elements of collective impact, but not necessarily all of the 5 conditions together. And that's actually what makes collective impact as a framework for community change. That's what makes it unique. It's really taking all of the 5 elements or all of the 5 conditions and working them together on this complex community issue that you're trying to move the needle on. And so the 5 conditions are having a common agenda, which includes a shared vision for change, a common understanding of the problem, and this notion of values and principles that are going to drive your work. So agreement on how you're going to get together through actions. The second condition is this idea of shared measurement. And shared measurement is I think, really important. It's not only to measure your progress, but it's also to understand, what are you learning as you're going, and how are you going to use this shared measurement to really hold yourselves accountable and hold the collective impact initiative accountable. I was just exchanging some emails with a poverty reduction initiative in New Hampshire, and they were focusing on the early years. And so the person who had emailed me asked me about shared measurement, and they asked, so what are the measures that would show progress? And I said, well, that's a difficult question to answer. You need to think about where do you want to show progress. And so in the early years, it might be, that related to poverty, it might be that you want to get the parents into the workforce, back into the workforce. So then the measures might be around accessible and affordable childcare in low-income neighborhoods. Or it might be focused on children getting ready to go into school, so getting ready to go into kindergarten. And so then you would want to use a population level measure that looked at school readiness, for example. And so shared measurement is really trying to focus on what are those measures that will show that you are making progress on this common agenda. So it's a really critical part of collective impact and part of the conversation. The third condition of collective impact is this idea of mutually reinforcing activities. So we've got our common agenda. We know what we're going to measure that show that we're making progress. Then you want to say, okay, so what are those activities that are either already exist in our community or ones that we have to grow that will get us to get us to the greatest success? And so if you're thinking about, the example that I just gave you about New Hampshire, one of the activities might be, okay, we're going to do a mapping of existing childcare spaces in these low-income neighborhoods and look at a bit of a gaps analysis and look at who are providing childcare spaces and how can we increase those opportunities for low-income families. So that might be that mutually reinforcing activities around that shared measure. In the case of school readiness, you might look at, okay, who's delivering programs and services in our community that are focused on parents engaging with their children in the early years. And so, in that case, you might look at libraries, or you might look at YMCAs or other literacy programs in the community and say, are these happening in low-income communities, and to what degree are there gaps? So you can see how the mutually reinforcing activities link into the shared measure, and the overall measure then is the part of the common agenda is to move the needle on poverty. The fourth element of collective impact is around continuous communication. Having lots of people engaged in a collective impact work really does mean that we have to pay attention to continuous communication. And then the final element, or the final condition of collective impact, is around backbone support or backbone infrastructure. And this is really, the sense of a leadership team and a small staffing component that are really focused on moving the whole collective impact initiative forward. And so you would have, when you came to the workshops in Red Deer and Windsor and Hamilton and Medicine Hat, you would have spent a lot of time really looking through these 5 conditions of collective impact And I just wanted to kind of just bring them forward again, because for some of you it was quite a while since you came to that workshop. So we're now going to focus significantly on building a common agenda. And so this slide really begins to say, this is what happens in collaboration, and this is what happens under this idea of collective impact, the common agenda in collective impact. And we're moving from what would typically happen in a collaboration, really focused on a single issue or a simple solution, to focusing on this idea of trying to tackle a complex community problem with lots of people that are engaged, and understanding that the problem is shifting and changing all the time. It's moving from individual missions to this idea of a shared aspiration. And I think, and you'll hear this in the presentation, but in developing a common agenda, you really want to build something that is aspirational, that is something that many partners in the community, beyond your own roundtable, that many partners can be inspired to join you on. Moving from being solely agenda-driven to taking a theory of change approach, moving from individual programs, the delivery of individual programs and services, right through to thinking about, how are we going to map the assets that exist in our community, and what does that look like? Moving from, diving right into the work without really paying attention to that really important element of collective impact, which is about relationship building, and that is expressed best through principles for working together. So these are the 5 big ideas: complex community problems, a shared aspiration, taking a theory of change approach, community asset mapping, and principles for working together, that are the ideas to build a common agenda. So here we dive into the work now. So the first element is around this complex community issue. And for those of you that attended the workshop, you'll remember this Stacy matrix. And this for us is a really critical piece of the thinking around collective impact. That, collective impact problems are best suited, or collective impact approaches are best suited in this kind of middle zone here, this zone of complexity, right? Where it's complex, there are multiple players that are engaged in the work, the problem changes, and each individual experience of the problem is unique. So if you think about, the example that I've given already this morning around the early years, the individuals in neighborhoods that are trying to advance poverty reduction by investing in the early years in these low-income neighborhoods, the family experiences are all going to be different. Some of those families will be single-parent families. Some of those families, both parents will have a job. Some of those families will have multiple children in those families. So the way that you're framing your collective impact work really has to recognize that the experiences of the people being impacted by the problem that you're trying to solve is going to be unique and variable across the context of your community. There are different kinds of problems in our communities as well, and I think this slide is very good at illustrating that. And it also says, that not every single problem requires a collective impact approach. So simple problems, you can follow the best practice recipe. You actually do not need to form a collective impact table and go through all of that work to solve a simple problem. You can actually solve a simple problem relatively simply, right? What are the things that we have to build in place, and how do we follow that best practice recipe to deliver that program or service? And simple problems generally are how many programs and services are delivered in our communities. Individual agencies target an individual element of the population to provide a program or service to that specific target group. Complicated problems really require more of a technical solution, and so you can use experts and experiment and find the answers. And so, there are things where, there are more complicated problems that our communities face. Political problems are ones where we have lots of lots of different opinions on how that problem might be resolved. And so you want to develop common ground, you want to compromise, and in some cases you actually might use competition as a strategy. Chaotic problems are problems that we are facing increasingly in our communities when there are big environmental issues like a flood or an earthquake. And in the case of chaotic problems, really what you want to do as a strategy is command and control. It's really about figuring out how to create stability in this time of chaos or some kind of major catastrophes that are happening in our communities. But complex problems, which are in the middle here, you really want to take the strategy of learning by doing and really engaging with other stakeholders that are also engaged in the problem. So this slide, the characteristics of complex problems. If you're involved in a collective impact initiative in the early stages, or you're thinking about a collective impact initiative, or you are midstream in your collective impact initiative, you can use this slide and these kind of characteristics as a way of saying, you know, is this really a complex issue that we're trying to solve? You know, is it difficult to frame? And difficult to frame really means that, you know, lots of people have different opinions about the issue. And we've seen that a lot in our work at Tamarack around poverty, right? Some people will say poverty is really related to stable housing and housing security. Others might say, well, it's about food security. Others might say it's about social inclusion. Some people will say it's about income security. So it's the fact that, you know, in your community, the complex problem, people in the community have multiple opinions about this complex problem, and so framing it is often difficult in the early stages of collective impact, and that's really challenging when you're trying to bring forward a common agenda, because you've got to get to agreement on, you know, not only are we going to work on the issue of poverty, for example, but this is the lens on that issue that we're going to take. We're going to focus on the senior population, or we're going to focus on, you know, Indigenous people or children and youth. And so we see many different approaches across the 55 different poverty strategies in Canada, but it is important to think about in the early stage discussions around, you know, your common agenda. How are we as a community going to frame this common agenda? The other characteristics that you can see here are that there are diverse stakeholders. I mentioned about already the experiences being unique. It is important to see that, you know, as you begin to do things in your community, the problem actually starts to evolve along and starts to be dynamic along with your collective impact interventions. And so that really says that in collective impact, it's not that you can say, okay, this is our framework for change and this is how we're going to move forward over the next 5 years. You've always got to be in tune with that and say, okay, so we decided we were going to step out on this issue, and all of a sudden here's a funding opportunity that has presented itself to move the needle on housing, for example. So how are we going to adapt relative to that new opportunity? So to really always look at the work as it evolves over time. The other things that we've learned at Tamarack is that there aren't really an obvious set of right or wrong solutions, because it is so dynamic and fluid. And, you know, we have come to some agreement around shared measurement. But again, we're using shared measurement in our poverty reduction evaluation as a way of continuously learning about how the issue is adapting and evolving over time. So here are some resources that you can tap into to really get a deeper understanding about complex issues and working with complexity. Brenda Zimmerman, who is a speaker at the Collective Impact Summit that will be happening in October, is also going to be talking about complexity, but she's done a couple of webinars that you can go onto our websites and access and listen to. And Mark Kabosh, the middle resource here in this list, actually has done a really cool webinar that looks at what kind of leadership do we need to then bring to our table, and what are those leadership competencies that we want to engage. working in collective impact and working on a complex community issue really does call for a different kind of leadership capacity. And so you might want to spend some time with that webinar with Mark around situational leadership and management to get a sense of that. So that was your first big idea, that building a common agenda has to reflect the fact that this is a complex community issue, that we have to act, react, and adapt, and that we always have to look at what is shifting and changing as we're intervening or trying to get the community to intervene on this change. Our second big idea is this idea of a community aspiration. And so too often in collaborative work, it's usually driven by the mission or vision of the lead organization that has convened the collaborative table. So it isn't something, those of us that have participated in collaboration have found that, yes, we have something to contribute to that, but it's good when there is alignment with our own organizational mission, but we really often do see it as in service to the group that has convened that collaborative table. In collective impact, this is where it's different, right? In collective impact, you really want to get as many people in the community as possible to say, yes, this is an issue that we're very interested in and that we also have something that we can contribute to. And so this idea of a community aspiration really says it's beyond the scope of the roundtable that is trying to move this issue forward. It's actually embracing the whole community in this. So Jay Connor is someone that I've followed for a long time, and he was the person that, for me, initially talked about this idea of a common agenda from the perspective of an aspiration, something that we can all aspire to. And so he has done a couple of blogs that you can find on the Vibrant Canada website or on the CCI website around the 7 habits of highly effective communities. And the first habit is to really build this aspiration, build it beyond, the people on the table. This is the change that we are envisioning for our community, whether it's to reduce poverty, to make sure that everybody has a home, to make sure that every kid, every youth graduates from high school successfully. Whatever your aspiration is, you really want to build it. And when you build an aspiration, what happens is that you are creating pathways for other people in the community to really connect with the work that you're wanting to build in your collective impact initiative. The challenge is number 3. So yesterday I was chatting with some folks in the Arctic who are working on a healthy living or a healthy eating, active living initiative. And so they're really working across the Northwest Territories and the Yukon trying to get people to think about healthy living or healthy eating and active living. And they said, we have a ton of people that are wanting to do all these different kinds of initiatives. And I said, well, if your 3 focus points are nutritional food, activity, and literacy, you've got to hold the center on those. And so if you're going to provide resources or funding, your activities should at least try to address 2 to 3 of your priority areas. And that's a really interesting way of holding the center. So yes, build this big community aspiration. We want to reduce poverty, but our center is going to be focusing on child poverty. In this case, they have this territory-wide initiative, but their center is to focus on those kinds of programs and services that really are pushing strategies or advancing strategies around, healthy and nutritious food, activity, and increasing literacy skills. So that's about holding the center, because when I worked at the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, the CEO of the Community Foundation said our work was death by 1,000 opportunities. And I think that is, one of the challenges in collective impact is to kind of hold that center and look at those activities, those mutually reinforcing activities that are going to give you the biggest, advance you the most in your work. The other habits you can read on this slide and think about a little bit more, and read about them more on Jay's blog post. In terms of building a common agenda, here's an example that Sylvia Chu, a colleague of mine at Tamarack, has shared. And so this is how they were trying to build their common agenda for the Headwaters Community in Action Initiative. So they have their foundations of healthy communities. So their big agenda is community well-being. Their aspiration is around community well-being. Their foundations are looking at healthy people, a dynamic economy, a sustainable environment, vibrant culture, and engaged citizens. And then they really wanted to ground their work in the survey that they did of the citizens in their region. And so they built their common agenda based on what they learned from the citizen survey. And so it's a way that they've really been able to do this work and hold the center of their work, and also make it aspirational. So some of the things to consider when you're thinking about a community aspiration, you want to frame it in a positive way. In Hamilton, the aspiration for the Poverty Roundtable is to make Hamilton the best place to move from charity to investment. So each of the communities has this kind of aspirational approach. It has to be beyond the reach of the organizational partners around the table. You really want to look at, how can our community be connected to this and be engaged with this? It's something that should be created together. You shouldn't have someone sit in a room and do it all by themselves. It should be shared, created together and shared broadly, and it should be informed by data. That is really critical in collective impact, is to really use data to inform the work. Here are some resources that you want to follow up on that would be helpful in terms of thinking about building your common agenda from the perspective of an aspirational call to action for your citizens. The third tool or resource or big idea is to kind of not use the traditional logic model approach to collective impact. It's really to think about, could we use a theory of change approach to help us in this work? So a theory of change, there are certain elements to it. And this, if you think about, this idea of complex community issues and the fact that they're difficult to frame, a theory of change says, well, even though they're difficult to frame, we actually do have to think about what the framing is. And so what are the features that we feel is important in the issue that we're trying to advance? What are some of the causes? What occurred in our community to get people into this problem or this situation? And so what are some of the causes? And that's where you start to look at the root causes and the interrelation of the root causes. What are some of the options that we have available to us to actually make progress? Are there leverage points that are happening? Did new funding occur? Did new leadership come into the community? Is there all of a sudden some interest by people that there hadn't been before? So in Ontario, we're going into a very interesting time because they've just renewed the provincial strategy on poverty for the province of Ontario, and so they've identified some new opportunities in the provincial strategy. So those are some of those options and leverage points that you want to pay attention to, not only what's happening in your local community, but also what's happening externally, at the provincial level or at the federal level, and are there funding opportunities that are happening? Or if you're in a network of others that are connected into this work, what are the other opportunities that, a colleague, partner community has already done that you might be able to bring into your work? And then planning and implementation and evaluation. So theory of your initiative, what is most successful in terms of developing this theory is that it should be explicit and documented. And it should be something that you can share widely amongst stakeholders in your community. It also should be an approach that you can say, well, there's logic to this, right? There's logic to our aspiration, to our theory of change, and these are the results that we're anticipating. So it actually builds into, a theory of change approach builds into the first three conditions of collective impact, that of a common agenda, shared measurement, and mutually reinforcing activities. So here's a tool. I think those of you that came to the workshop, you probably have seen this tool. We just wanted to bring it back up. It's a great tool for engaging your community in terms of discussing the common agenda approach. And what I really like about this tool is that it helps to surface amongst your groups what their assumptions are, and that's always a really interesting discussion. You know, what are our assumptions about this issue or about the problem that we're trying to address, and also what are some of those influential factors that we need to pay attention to. So if you think back, you know, a couple of slides ago, these options and this causality, this tool actually helps us start to think through those and really help us build our theory of change approach. So it's a great resource to use in terms of thinking through your common agenda. Here are a few more resources for you. So Tom Kelly has done a great presentation at our last the Collective Impact, or the Communities Collaborating Institute, that was held in Edmonton. He did a workshop and he did a keynote address, so those slides are available, link, as well as some other resources. Our fourth idea is around community asset mapping, our fourth big idea. So we know that collective impact exists at the top end of the collaboration spectrum, where we really need to build trust and we really are more tightly coupled together. In collective impact, we want to bring in different sectors. We really do want to engage different sectors. And this slide begins to say, you know, that there is real value in bringing the different sectors into the conversation. And so for those of you that are seasoned in collective impact, you'll already know the value of having people with lived experience engaged in the work. It's sometimes more challenging to engage citizens in the business sector, but I would say try your hardest or your darndest to get them involved, because they can really advance the work in ways that you'd never thought was possible. Here's a way to kind of asset map. So around your common agenda, so depending on where you land on your aspiration, who are the people in the business community that might be attracted to the common agenda? Who are the key nonprofit leaders you want to have involved? Who are the government leaders that you want to involve? And who are the citizens that would be key in helping drive this work forward? So again, some resources for you. Mark Holmgren is a thought leader with Tamarack. He also leads a really cool and creative homelessness organization called the Bissell Center in Edmonton. I don't know if you've ever read Mark's work, but he also publishes regularly in the Tamarack CCI website and also has his own newsletter called Anticipate. So he's written a blog about the drivers of collaboration. The next resource is an asset mapping tool, and then the third resource is a book by John McKnight and Peter Block around how we can really create this notion of abundant communities. And there's lots of really good thinking in that book. So the final big idea connected to a common agenda is really this idea of principles for working together. And you know, what we've learned in collective impact work is that if we haven't done a deep discussion of what are those values and principles early on in our work, collective impact is such that it's dynamic and shifting and changing all the time, that we are going to bump up against something where our partners are interpreting things in one way or another, and if we don't have values and principles that we can hang on to, we're going to have conflict around our table. So the principles for working together are best done when you're forming your common agenda. They're also a really great tool for engagement. So if you say, you know, we're going to work at being a very transparent collective impact work, or we're going to, you know, have shared decision making as one of our principles, then you can really use that to recruit different partners to the table. So some of the things to think about in terms of collective impact, this comes from some work that was done, the collaborative premise was done geez, I just forgotten his name. It's going to show up in the resources in the United States. So he says, you know, some of the things that we have to come to agreement on, that yes, it is a shared concern that we're addressing, that we do see collective impact as the right framework for moving forward together. We're going to determine how we work together. We have this shared understanding of the information and also a shared definition of the problem and agreement on the solution. So those are critical things to build in your thinking about this. Oh, so David Crislip is the person who really shared the work. So you can see the essential concepts for collaboration. David Crislip is the person to follow up in. He's also written a collaborative leadership field book that I think can be very helpful to you in terms of this work. And then finally, there's a resource on the Tamarack CCI website. I did a workshop a number of years ago on leadership governance and community collaboratives. And so there's a workbook in there that also focuses on this idea of shared principles. So it's a great resource for you to follow up on. Kirsty, can you just give me a time check? My BlackBerry is frozen.
Sure, Liz. Yeah, we're at 12:38. So we've got about 20 minutes to go or so.
Okay, perfect. So we're right on time. So the next slide, this slide is, we're going to enter into a question period in a few minutes. And so these are just some prompting thoughts for you to think about before we go into the question session. And so what ahas did you have from this session? Did any new questions emerge for you in terms of some of the materials that were presented? And then what's one thing you might do differently? So we're going to put those questions up here for you to begin thinking about as we enter into the dialogue. But before we do that, we have another poll that we want to have you do. So this is our next webinar poll. So which big idea is most useful to you in terms of your current work around collective impact? So was the big idea around understanding complexity and its approach most useful? Was it around community aspirations, a theory of change, asset mapping, or this notion of developing principles for working together? Give you a few minutes to answer this poll. And Kirsty, you can let me know when the poll has been responded to.
Absolutely, Liz. People are voting at this moment, and I see we've got about 70% voted so far.
Great.
Give them a little bit more time here.
Yeah, I think when we get to about 85 or so percent, that's okay. Good. Can close the poll.
Wonderful. So we've got actually 100 people, 100% have voted. So we've got 7% chose understanding complexity, 29% chose community aspirations, another 29% chose theory of change, 21% voted for community asset mapping, and 14% voted for principles for working together.
Oh, okay. So we've got a kind of a nice mix across the 5 big ideas.
Yep.
Great, great. So now, Kirsty, I think what we can do is open it up for maybe 10 or 15 minutes of questions and answers for folks. And then for those of you on the line, we hope that you will stay on the line because we have a bit of an evaluation poll. This is something new that we're trying with our webinars at Tamarack, and a couple of other resources to share with you at the end. So don't click off completely yet. If you can stick with us for the next 10 or 15 minutes, that would be great. I'm going to put up our prompting reflections at this point. And Kirsty, can you open up the line?
Yeah, for sure. So everyone's been on mute for the call so far. Just to avoid feedback, I'm going to ask you if you have a question to please raise your hand. Use the raise your hand function in your go-to control panel, and I'll unmute your lines one at a time to ask your questions. If you are not hooked up to audio today or you'd prefer just to ask your question through the chat box, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Just type it right into the go-to control panel, and then I can announce it out loud for you for Liz to respond to. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand or type it into the questions box.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, if you have an experience that you want to share with the others, that would also be great. I mean, these are ideas that we have at Tamarack around Common Agenda, but we'd also love to hear from you about your experiences as well.
Absolutely. Please raise your hand if you'd like me to open your line up. Not seeing too much activity yet, Liz.
Okay, so maybe I will ask someone then to share their experience. So I know that do we have anybody from Windsor from Pathway to Potential on the call?
We do have a team from Pathway to Potential. I know Adam's on the line.
So Adam, why don't you share your experience in terms of getting to a common agenda in terms of the work that you've done at Pathway to Potential?
Well, it looks like Adam is can't be unmuted until he enters a code. So Adam, I've just sent you a code. There's a pin that you need to put into the phone, I think, to be unmuted. If you want to give that a shot, then we can give this a try. There we go. Hi, Adam.
Oh, great. I was just out of the room for a second, though. Can you repeat the question?
So Adam, we're just wanting you to share some of your experiences in terms of what you guys did at Pathway to Potential to getting to a common agenda for your work.
Sure. We're now in we passed the 5-year mark, so early on, definitely in the first year or so, it was really about meeting with the key community partners, committees, coalitions, to sort of let them know about what the poverty reduction strategy's vision was, and to really try to engage them in that process so that they didn't feel like this was sort of just the same old sort of initiative that's being announced, that's being thrust on the community. And it took some time initially to sort of get people to buy into that notion of I think of a collaborative multi-sector approach. So it really, a lot of the early work was focused on getting the word out, communicating to different sectors about what we were trying to do, and get them and try and meet them wherever they were at a given point in time. And I think because of the players involved with the municipality playing a lead role and the United Way being actively involved in university and the legal clinic, we really had some strong partners involved, but we had to branch out and make sure that we were engaging broader sections of the community. So another part that really helped our work early on was engaging people with lived experience of poverty to make sure that the work was grounded in the lived realities of people from our area, because that was something that I don't think had been sort of adequately thought of in developing the structure and everything. So the other thing that's evolved, that's happened as we've evolved, has been having a much better understanding at Pathway to Potential of when we can play a lead role, meaning there's a clear gap in the community where there isn't an entity or a group that's really taking the lead on an issue, such as right now I would say affordable transportation, and where we are better suited to play a supportive role. So for example, looking at our area of housing and homelessness initiatives in the community, there are well-established committees and structures in place to deal with that issue. So I think we've become, it's sort of become a really important part of our work to assess who is doing work really well in the community, and when that's happening, how do we connect and link in with those groups, but in order to support them and to share information, but not to sort of take over. So I think because we've played that role and taken that approach, we're now seen more and more as able to play a convening role or bridging different groups or different sectors, which wasn't always the case. Early on, there was a lot of mistrust, I think, and skepticism about another new initiative coming into the community. So it's certainly been a good learning as far as, really needing to pay attention to where the community's at and what the strengths are in the community, and then trying to build off of that. And now we're at a stage, I think, where we're starting to see a lot more. It feels like there's more acceleration of some of our work where we're talking with United Way currently about shared measurement between the United Way and the city and the county. So that's really encouraging, and also not just those two players, but other funders in the community. So I think because of some of that trust, that enables us to work at a deeper level and start to tackle some of these bigger challenges around collective impact. But I guess one of the big learnings for me is that you really can't try and rush through any of the steps, and if you do, you'll end up paying for it ultimately. So it's been really helpful, though, to have resources through Tamarack and Vibrant Communities to really add legitimacy and credibility to the work we're doing into the model. That plays a big role.
And
does that help?
Yeah, that's great. And I know that in the last couple of years, you guys went through a whole kind of theory of change process where you now have actually a pretty nice articulation of the work that you're doing. Has that been a helpful kind of tool to take out to the community to talk about your work and to share with community partners about the work and how you see it advancing?
It's been really helpful, and thanks too for helping. You helped our community at that stage where we were just trying to create it and think about what that might look like. But it's actually been really useful because for as much as we had talked prior to creating that framework for change, we had talked a lot about how we're different. We're not a traditional organization, but until we had that visual, I don't think it always sunk in with people. So it was really helpful to have that framework on one page of paper where people could say, okay, I understand where, because it visually showed people where we were leading in certain areas, but it also showed the comprehensiveness that was required to really move the needle, and it didn't suggest that Pathway to Potential alone would be able to do it. So it I think, reinforced the point that it has to be a community-wide effort. And it really helped answer the questions that we often would get, which were, well, if you're a poverty reduction strategy, why aren't you leading in the area of housing, or why aren't you doing this on, immigration? And we could say, well, we have, the Homeless Coalition or the Local Immigration Partnership who are part of this bigger picture, and they're needed for this strategy to work. So yeah, it's been really helpful to have that. It's made the work of communicating about our strategy a lot more effective too, and easier.
Yeah, I think, Adam, and I think just for everybody else on the call, one of the things that I've been realizing more and more around collective impact is that even though collective impact is, hard work and, we're moving all these bubbles forward at the same time, these conditions forward at the same time, we need simple things, simple tools, simple approaches, simple frameworks for change that we can communicate to our partners in a way that they can begin to see how to get engaged with the work. And so it's a bit of it's almost a little bit of a contradiction, right? That we're working in complexity and with this complex problem, and yet the way that we've got to really think about it is, how can we make it simple for people to also be engaged with this complex community issue? So that's great. Thanks. Thanks, Adam.
My pleasure.
No problem. Kirsty, any other questions?
I do have one comment here from Kathy Ferguson, Liz. I'm just going to read it out loud because she wrote it into the question box. So she says, our organization focuses highly on logic models, and I have been struggling with how to do collective impact and have a logic model at the same time. This seemed counterproductive, so theory of change is definitely a helpful concept for our work to explore.
Yeah. So there is logic in a theory of change approach, right? So you are kind of following the elements, The thing about collective impact, I think that that lends itself more significantly to theory of change is this idea that it is a complex issue and that things are shifting and adapting all the time. And in logic models, you're not always able to engage with this kind of shifting and adapting. Logic models basically take you through a process that says, you know, we'll do this, this, and this, and we'll get these kind of outcomes. And so there is logic behind a theory of change, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility and adaptability. So I would suggest you go to that Imagine, Act, Believe resource under theory of change. It's a really great resource to consider. And maybe, Kirsty, as one additional bonus for everybody that's stuck with us on this call, we can send out some examples like Adam's in the Pathway to Potential example around theory of change approaches, some pictorial examples that would help people. I've got a PowerPoint of that we can also include as an added bonus so that people can see what we mean and how, you know, how it's been translated by some of the Vibrant community partners.
Sounds great.
Okay, so now we've only got a few minutes left, and we've got a couple more things that we want to do before the end of the webinar. So I'm going to move us forward, if I can here. Takes a second for my thing to move forward. There we go. We have one more webinar poll, and this is an evaluation that we are testing with you guys. So you're the first group. So did this webinar meet your current needs, spark a new idea, provide useful tools, leave you wanting more, or all of the above? So if we could have you vote, that would be great.
Just over 60% right now. 85. Couple more votes here. All right.
Great.
I will share the results. It
Okay.
looks like 17% chose met my current needs, 8% chose sparked a new idea, 17% chose provided useful tools, 0 said left me wanting more, and 58 said all of the above.
Oh, great. So that's good. So we satisfied lots of you guys in terms of the design of the webinar. So that's really good feedback. Thanks a lot. Just a couple of final things that we have happening at Tamarack. I'm not sure if you all know that Paul Bourne has released a new book called Deepening Community. He's been out to a number of communities and shared his thinking about this. There are opportunities for you to get involved on the Deepening Community.org website. We invite you, if you've read the book, to post your ideas or thoughts. And if you'd like to have Paul come to your community and to do a presentation about his thinking in this book, I know that he's done a number of these in the spring of this year, but he's also thinking about going to communities across the fall. So we'd also welcome that opportunity, and you can let Caroline know if that's something that you're interested in. We have an upcoming learning event. I mentioned the Collective Impact Summit that is coming up in October, but we also have a 3-day workshop happening in Winnipeg, November 18th to 20th, on evaluating community impact. So for those of you that are interested in learning more about evaluation, look up that. And then here is the latest on a link to the latest on the Collective Impact Summit that Kirsty is going to be the lead organizer for. So we hope that some of you will be able to join us at the Collective Impact Summit and learn a bit more about all things collective impact. So I think I'm going to throw it back over to you, Kirsty, for the wrap-up, and thank everybody for participating in this webinar. Over to you, Kirsty.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on the webinar today. We will be sending a follow-up email, which will include the PowerPoint presentation recording of today's webinar. So look for those in your inbox the next couple of days. I also want to mention that today, starting at 3:15 Eastern, we're actually going to be holding another webinar, which is an opportunity for you to ask any questions you may have around the Collective Impact Summit. If you're considering coming, if you're already registered, please feel free to register for that webinar as well. The registration link can be found on our main website, tamarackcommunity.ca. Just go to our events tab and you'll find it there. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.